From a structural engineering perspective, how does disaster risk reduction shape the way we design the built environment, and how can engineers account for social vulnerability in high-risk areas?
As structural engineers, we often focus on life safety, and as we've experienced more disasters, not just earthquakes, what I'm most familiar with, but all kinds of disasters, we realize that post-disaster housing and post-disaster realities are a very different story than new construction and new buildings. And life safety doesn't mean habitability. So I just completed my Cal OES SAP training, and the purpose of rapid evaluation is so that we can get families and people back into their homes, so people are not having to leave their communities after disaster events, which, as you know, are happening more and more from a climate and from a geohazard perspective.
When disaster strikes, the impact isn't felt equally. And in communities where outdated infrastructure intersects with limited resources, the risks grow, and the need for resilient, equitable design becomes not just important, but urgent. In today's episode, we're honored to be joined by Dr. Zahraa Saiyed, a PE Associate AIA and the CEO of Scyma Consulting, a leading voice at the intersection of disaster risk reduction, social equity, and structural engineering. She'll be talking about how the role of structural engineers is expanding, not just in designing to meet code, but addressing the deeper systemic vulnerabilities that shape how communities experience and recover from disasters. From rethinking building codes and redefining community engagement to framing resilience as a shared responsibility, Dr. Saiyed brings powerful insights and practical strategies that bridge technical excellence with meaningful social impact. I'm your co-host, Matt Picardal.
And I am your co-host, Alex Datto, and this is the Structural Engineering Channel.
Hi, Zahraa. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Matt and Alex, for having me. It's such a pleasure to be on today.
Yeah, could you tell us a little bit about I know you have a more unique career path spanning engineering, architecture, and policy. What inspired you to get into that, and maybe just talk a little bit about your career path that made it so unique?
Yeah, sure. So I started off actually as an architect. I trained and studied as an architect. I was initially going into medicine, and I decided that I didn't want to let go of my art side of me. And so I began my schooling in architecture, and I realized that I really wanted to hold on to sort of the quantitative aspect of what I like to do in high school. And I found something called the realm of study of building science, which is trying to make sort of like net zero buildings. And I did that for a little bit. And then I met Professor Miho Mazuriu while I was in grad school, and she ran the Urban Risk Lab at MIT, and she was an architect and a landscape architect. And that kind of exposed me to the world of disasters and the disaster risk reduction. And I remember a conversation I had with her early on. I joined her lab, and she said, often architects are not invited to these spaces. And so I realized that disaster risk reduction typically comprises of engineers, policymakers, and insurers, at least at that time. That's what I was noticing in the different kind of professional events that were happening. And so I loved being a creative, and I loved, how we studied society as architects and design spaces contextually. But I realized if I wanted to have a career in disaster risk reduction, I would need the language of engineering to be that architect and at the table that can also talk about average annual losses and understand that kind of language. And so, but I always loved structural engineering, and I loved kind of artistry, but also the quant side of things. And that's how I got into structural engineering. And from there, I worked in disaster risk reduction for a really long time, and I realized that we're not talking about singular buildings. We're talking about societies. I live in the Bay Area. We're not going to have an earthquake on the San Andreas Fault that's just going to hit one city. It's going to be a regional impact. So in order to make regional changes, you need policy at the level above building codes. And so I started working with different professional organizations, mostly the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute, American Society of Civil Engineers, and started getting a bit more into the risk governance aspect of structural engineering and disasters. And that led me to further study. And I completed my doctorate last year in law and policy on these topics. But that's kind of the way that my life went. So I call myself a building person with a bit of a policy know-how, but it was all very sort of finding gaps, perceived gaps in what I saw and stepping into them one step at a time. And I think that's how I got here today, so many decades later.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Sorry, no, wow, that's an amazing path. Can you tell us a little bit more from a structural engineering perspective? How does disaster risk reduction shape the way we design the built environment? And how can engineers account for social vulnerability in high risk areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, as structural engineers, we often focus on life safety. And as we've experienced more disasters, not just, earthquakes, what I'm most familiar with, but all kinds of disasters, we realize that post-disaster housing and post-disaster realities are a very different story than, new construction and new buildings. And life safety doesn't mean habitability. So I just completed my Cal OES SAP training, and the purpose of rapid evaluation is so that we can get families and people back into their homes, so people are not having to leave their communities after disaster events, which, as you know, are happening more and more from a climate and from a geohazard perspective. So where engineering kind of has its value and where we see ourselves mostly is in a post-disaster scenario. However, I think what we can do more in terms of proactivity is thinking about habitability and concepts of functional recovery, which thankfully are making a little bit more headway in Congress and in different communities that have risk. Functional recovery essentially is performance targets that buildings are not just safe to exit. So when a disaster happens, it's not that, you can exit safely and evacuate, but you're able to come back into the building. And I think it's really essential because you're thinking about the lifespan of buildings that we are building in highly disaster risk prone areas now. And they hadn't always been, but coastal areas are now more prone to sea level rise. So do we just make everybody leave? That's not pragmatic when we have such housing shortages. So we think about buildings, new and current, that can kind of withstand the different kinds of impacts that are going to happen, and people are assured that to a degree they can come back and stay in their houses and possibly their workplace places. Excuse me. So to better account for social vulnerability, engineers should really work with planners, public health officials, and local communities. We should ask, who are the people that live in these buildings? Can they afford retrofits? Will they have a place to go during reconstruction? These are the kinds of ideas that we're not typically thought to think about, but I think more and more we can't evade anymore either, because our role is not just giving the numbers and the risk metrics. It's more like it's a community that I want to live in and I want to support with my technical background and whatever, skills I have, in order to understand that I have to be part of the social fabric and the political fabric of those communities. So it's more and more that I'm not looking at myself as just somebody who has certain skills I can talk about safety, but that my experience is just as valuable as my a neighbor's or somebody else in the community that might live in a home that's not, seismically appropriate for the risk. And so how do I work with, planners, developers, the city, to ensure that we're not just building, building, building and not thinking about the very possible risks to all kinds of people in different kinds of buildings in our society. So I think it really starts from thinking about your own community and really thinking about it, like who lives here, what do they need, how can I help? And it sometimes means that you have to go a little bit beyond your comfort zone. And I think it's valuable. It's part of the evolution.
I did want to jump into the Cal, because I took the Cal OES training too a couple of years ago, or a year back or so, and that was really cool for the engineers or the students that don't know too much about it. It's essentially where you become. It's training to become a second responder, I believe, after a disaster happens, and the main goal is not to go rescue people, but to make sure that the people can get back into their houses as soon as possible. Because, I mean, essentially, that's what, as you were mentioning, Zara, that's what makes a community. People need their houses to get back into, and that training was pretty cool. So, if engineers that haven't gone through that, I think it is pretty good training, just because you can see what this resilience is all about too. And that's one way to help the community as well, trying to get people back into their homes as quickly as possible. And could you also, I know you mentioned working with different entities such as engineers, architects, the political aspect of it. Can you walk us through a project that maybe that was a marginalized community, how you work with them, and what was your approach to ensure equitable resilience for that?
Yeah, so one of the projects that I found very memorable was one called Lima Safe Schools, Lima in Peru. I worked with the World Bank and MIT's Urban Risk Lab years ago on this project, and it was really fascinating because they were focused on, from the technical component, they were focused on public schools in Lima, Peru, which were seismically unsafe, many of them masonry, but they were also addressing social elements of bullying, gang initiation for young, very young people in Lima. So it was the social and technical part of it, and really it converged at the place of spatiality in terms of buildings, in terms of planning. And so we went to Lima, we spoke with psychologists, we spoke with educators, we were the team of engineers and architects, but I never experienced a project that so equally was focused on the structural safety, the technical safety, the life safety, and also the social resilience so head on to say, yeah, we have a bullying problem. Yeah, we have lots of young kids that don't, come from the best socioeconomic, you know, situation. They're getting into these gang issues, and we want to try to make spaces where they feel safe and their family feels safe leaving them there. And so we reimagined schools that were sort of socially embedded and multifunctional urban spaces, and we used concepts of safety evoking, but also being physically safe from earthquakes in our planning. And so we tried to rethink how to redesign and retrofit these schools into urban corridors, creating key nodes like parks and like painting the streets, having better lighting. This is a proposal. And kind of tying in where students were coming to, where they lived to where they were going, and making sure all of that felt very safe, very visible to everybody around them in the community, that they can say, look, if this is a place that young kids go, we're not going to do anything shady over here. And then also making sure that the schools were safe enough from a structural standpoint. And I think the idea that, risk mitigation is most effective when it fosters a sense of societal ownership. This is something that I learned, one of these, this is a formative project, but I learned that you can't, as a technical person, just impose your ideas. I mean, I'm not Peruvian. So we really had to work with the students, to work with the communities, to let them feel like this was for them and by them. And we were just there as guides. And so, really wonderful experience and kind of really hit at the head of where a structural engineer's role, how it can expand and where we can go, and how much my mind grew in just that one project, that one experience. And yeah, thank you for reminding me to talk about it, because it was really kind of shaped the trajectory of where I am today.
Yeah, it seems like a really
Wow.
holistic approach, right? In terms of literally and mental space wise, it's a safe place for the students and the teachers and the community, but also seismically safe for any earthquakes and whatnot. And getting all of that together, yeah, that seems like what it should be, right? In terms of it's a communities building, giving them ownership of what to do with the spaces.
Absolutely.
I thought it was interesting. You start talking about how to light the exterior areas and paint around outside of the building. Because when you go to architecture school, which I was arch-e, so I had a little bit of architecture school, and then we start talking about programming and planning out how buildings are gonna, all the different rooms are gonna fit together and function, but start to expand that out into the community of exactly how can we keep people safe from school to maybe the grocery store or after school care, and then continuing that even further into policy. It's really interesting work that I don't think I've ever really thought about before. So what role does building code reform or evolution play in strengthening community resilience, especially for vulnerable populations?
Yeah, happy to answer that. So, one of the things that I want to highlight is that lots of states, at least in the United States, they don't have a state code that's the up to date. And so that means that communities don't have up to date codes and then it's not mandated for them. So at the most basic level, there's a lot of work to be done in terms of we're creating these, triennially we're updating our codes, but those codes don't really land to communities. So a low hanging fruit is trying to, as engineers, to get those building codes up to date and implemented and actually properly enforced, because just having a code but not having an enforcement body, basic thing, it sounds simple, but sometimes resources are limited, disasters are not top of mind. But this is like something that we as engineers can continually fight for and continually advocate for. So that's the basic, most bottom level thing. Now, in terms of resilience, building codes are really powerful. They make sure that we have a minimum standard of life safety, but they're not inherently equitable. Most focus on new construction. So when, lots of cities say, okay, if we're going to fund this project, you have to build it to the latest code. And new construction doesn't typically benefit higher income populations. You would call them vulnerable populations because intersectionally they do hit a lot of the criteria that we would call vulnerable, not native English speakers, sometimes not highly educated, lower socioeconomic and status, et cetera, et cetera. And so retrofitting older buildings that usually house lower income or minority residents is rarely required and often very difficult to fund. So, we have soft story policies in California that are looking at funding based on social vulnerability metrics, but as based on current administration and different the changes in policies that have to happen with different election cycles, those are not always guaranteed. So, we are looking at laws that want to have basic building codes, but those building codes typically are applied to newer construction, less often to buildings that are already vulnerable and house socially vulnerable people. And so another element of this is, which I think is important to mention, is that when we talk about equity, we also talk about race-based equity, and race is not something that people want to talk about. In fact, there's a deliberate effort to remove race from social vulnerability criteria, and it's something that is actually very tied to social vulnerability in of itself. So we're having push and pull of a society that's sensitive to concepts of race and equity, but at the same time, in order to understand how we can have universal building codes that do help people that are most in need, the people that are most likely to get displaced and least likely to come back, that probably only have one place of residence in the United States and not multiple homes that people maybe in wealthier communities do. Um, we are we have work to do on that. And I think the building codes are a really positive step, in getting involved in them is really positive, because there's a lot more work we can do for, functional recovery and implementing that, raising awareness on that. But ultimately, codes must be tied to funding mechanisms that do not place undue burden on marginalized communities. And right now, we're not having that. People need to pay their bills. People need to get food on the table. They're not thinking about seismic retrofits and tie downs. And so, what is the bigger question of social vulnerability and engineering is, who takes the risk and who gets the benefit? And where do skills and smart brains that we have in terms of understanding risk and risk reduction from a seismic perspective or engineering perspective, where do our minds play a role in these bigger social policy governance questions? And that's something that is, state by state. So I guess my conclusion in this, in a nutshell, is that building codes are not necessarily equitable, but it requires community level advocacy, state-based advocacy to get them there.
That's really interesting. So curious, when you say that, I mean, how does somebody go about that? And I mean, we could answer it from the point of view of an engineer, architect, or just a layperson. I mean, if we're trying to motivate people to go out, I mean, I've been listening to you, and I'm not really sure, even from my point of view, how I could get involved and try to make an impact.
Yeah, this is a really important question. So my entire doctoral research was on how do practitioners address equity, and I focus on wildfires and earthquakes because that's the hazard those are the hazards that I'm mainly working in. But it was a practitioner focused dissertation. And then so I interview people just like you about various different legal mandates, federal level, and also from an organizational perspective on increasing equity. And how do people feel about it? Do people even understand what equity-based design, equity-based solutions, what does it mean? And ultimately, what I learned from this process is people have very good intentions. They really do want to reduce social vulnerability to disasters, but the mechanisms to get there for various hazards highly dependent on one's view and one's organizational backing of what equity means. So, for example, I think the biggest thing that kept coming up and something that I think we could encourage is as an engineer, how much are you even raising awareness about the potential risks of hazards? That in itself can become an equity question. So, who are the people that understand earthquakes are really bad? The way it's going to happen in California is going to look like this. How many people actually can not just know that information, but digest it in a way that they can take action and who have funding behind it to take the action? What is an engineer's responsibility in raising that awareness? What I found is that the people that had resources were the first ones to raise their hands in the room to say, oh, I want to be part of this community engagement process. I want to be at the hearing. I want to be talking to my policymaker to state my needs about the funding that I need to make my house seismically safe. Now, that's one category of groups of people that actually are able to make their lives, their homes a little safer. What about the people that have a million different other priorities and disaster safety is like very much the bottom? Do we just is it just, risk at your own, what is it called? Cross at your own risk, or owner takes liability or renter takes liability. I mean, that in itself is a problem, is that many socially vulnerable people are renters and they do not have say on the quality of their building necessarily. So first part of this is awareness, of raising awareness, because we know very intimately and oftentimes a little too well what the detriment and the risk outcomes are going to be, but we don't know how to convey it. And I think one thing I think about somebody who is an instructor and somebody who's taught at various different levels is you have to teach to a beginner's mind, and you have to speak the language of the people that can are different audiences. So I think the last thing I wanted to say on this equity is that we need better multilingual training on equity principles as engineers, and integrating social vulnerability in our hazard models and being able to talk about it to different kinds of audiences. So that's, I think, some of the barriers that we face and ways that we overcome, trying to build equity into our work.
Yeah, I had a follow up to that one too, because the things that you're bringing up were you're saying like one person has the financials and the time to do a seismic retrofit, but what about the other people, the ones that are just trying to survive? Not only are they just trying to survive, but maybe their place isn't seismically safe. What can they do about it? How do they get their voice in? And were there other more examples on that in terms of yeah, I guess the main problem first that you were mentioning is that most of them don't even know that they have a problem. They just assume buildings are, oh, I'm in California, or I guess our buildings are going to be just fine during an earthquake. But then they go talk to an engineer. Engineer might tell them, yeah, it's not seismically safe because you need to do a performance-based design, etc., non-elastic stuff. Their mind kind of just goes blank. But you're saying it's, yeah, teach to a beginner's mind. How would you explain it to a child, essentially, in terms of that? And that just reminds me on my personal story where I was just going to talk to people and people asked what I do. And then it was just like a random guy that yeah, I was interacting with asking me like, yeah, earthquakes. Oh, so you design for earthquakes. Is my house safe? Like, he was asking me that question. Like, yeah, what type of house do you live in? Oh, it was like built in the 50s and it's made out of wood and 2 stories. Do I have to worry about that? And it was kind of like, yeah. And engineers for us, I mean, one thing we could do is just like explain to them. Probably the most safest thing that you can do for those types of buildings is, trying to see if it's probably going to slide off of its foundation since it was on a raised foundation. Go check that out. Go look at a website. Uh, Go talk to Alex about those types of seismic retrofits that you could do for your house like that. But yeah, that was. I was wondering if there are more examples like that where there's that inequality that's showing up that we may not be too found about.
There's a privilege to understand your disaster risk and do something about it. At the barest of minimum, people have I mean, I'm not saying it's a small thing to do. I think it's a great thing, but have their disaster kit ready, have extra water, all these things. But anything really beyond that is somebody who has the time and the resources to think about it. And risk averseness and risk know-how is very personality dependent. I'm not saying that just because you have, you're coming from a particular community that's affluent, that has, safer homes, that you might be somebody who thinks about earthquake loss more than somebody who might not, that lives in a kind of a rental and it's, might be a soft story. It's very dependent. But I think one thing is that the way that we send messages to different people needs to be empowering. So no matter who you're talking to, whether we're talking to people that have oftentimes retirees that have more time to go to their community hearings and work with policy and engagement and all this. How do we talk to them versus somebody who doesn't, mother that's working two jobs but lives in a rental and that has multiple seismic deficiencies and but they don't have the time and they cannot make it to these public hearings. How do we message them to empower them so that nobody is going to want to hear that they're socially vulnerable. Nobody wants to know anything that would make them feel less than, right? And we don't want to be there. I think what we have to do is when we know information like that, when we have data to back that, most likely this household that lives here does not have enough financial resources to sustain them from this earthquake and come back into their home, wait for the retrofit, lose their job. Most likely this person is going to get displaced forever or has to leave this community. If we can have that information that's quantitatively and possibly qualitatively backed, then I think it's our responsibility to convey that to policymakers. In my experience, when I've talked to my state or local and federal too, but mostly the state representatives, there it always boils down to how much is this going to cost and who is going to lose and how much are they going to lose. And so being able to answer those questions quickly and not have to get into probabilistic risk assessment metrics and all that is an art, and you have to work to get there. And what they have asked and what a very, let's say, disaster proactive or disaster savvy politician or policymaker will ask for is that we come up with our priorities as a community, as an organization together, because we have the knowledge. We don't want to place additional burdens on people that cannot take it, but we know that they're going to be the ones that are hit the hardest. So right now with the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute, the Public Policy Group, they are coming up with a list of several policy priorities that they're sending around to different policymakers before legislative season starts. I don't know if I'm deviating from your question, but really, I think that if we're talking about how do social structural engineers make an impact, it has to be an understanding that we know a lot, but maybe we don't know how to convey it to the different audiences. And that can be my neighbor. It could be somebody who lives in my neighborhood, and I know that their home is on stilts. And it can also be my policymakers, and it can also be people that are working in city government that have never really addressed earthquake safety or wildfire safety in an adequate enough way. And so I think, we can practice these skills and get better at it and feel more comfortable getting in front of different audiences and not making it a woe is me thing. Perspective wise, psychology wise, people see a broken home, it's actually gonna shut them down. So you want to be you want to be good at conveying information that doesn't induce fear, but induces opportunity for safety. And that comes with some experience and practice.
Yeah, I bet that's a hard message to get through because I mean the real motivation behind wanting to make more resilient communities or buildings and everything like that is we don't want anything bad to happen. That's the first thing, but that's kind of the basis of the code right now. A general building code just promises life safety, not really that the buildings are going to be functional after. So I think we're actually talking about getting a little bit past that, even in the building code, whether or not it's just external policy or the code itself. Um, if we can think about the additional costs to build structures that are going to be resilient to the point where they're functional after a maximum considered event or some level of event that's reasonable economically, uh, that will keep communities get together more and eventually make up for the additional cost of the building a more resilient structure. But what I am still kind of struggling to understand is when we say policymakers, and maybe there's multiple answers to this, but which policymakers do you? I mean, do you go to the city officials, state? I mean, I would think mayors would be interested, governors, but probably assemblymen. I mean, is it all across the board, or is there a certain focus that makes the most sense?
I think it's all across. Thank you for that question, Alice. I think it's all across the board, and there's different organizations that approach this differently. But we have legislation at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level, and even at you know even in your neighborhood level, if you have a neighborhood organization. But we focus on, at least for earthquakes and wildfires, we focus heavily on federal funding that federal laws that need to often get funding every couple years to try to get those to be passed so that we have something at the national level that sets the guidelines for what states and localities can do. So, for example, for earthquakes, we have the Natural Earthquake Hazards Reduction Program, NEHRP, which we need to get reauthorized every 5 years. It's the only piece of legislation we have at the federal level that talks about earthquakes. And so, it's often about training, it's often about knowledge development and dissemination. This is the kind of stuff that happens at the federal level. They cannot mandate states to do anything. However, they can provide guidances, avenues, incentives. If we lose this piece of legislation, that's all we have, and kind of a shame. So at the federal level, we're working with. Oftentimes, we try to work, on both sides of the aisle and try to get policymakers to understand the benefits of this. And there's tons of research that show recovery dollars versus mitigation dollars, why building codes matter. This is the kind of material that we want to keep presenting over and over again and make it relevant. And now we have the equity component of it, which in this administration probably not as well picked up, but regardless, there are policymakers, lifelong people that are in different agencies of the federal government that know this, but they're the ones that are helping create the knowledge that then we keep pushing at the federal level to get more information, more funding, more grants to states and local communities. Now, at the state level, you have a bit more access and a bit more curation to what our needs are. Right now in California, where I reside, we have a huge housing issue and wildfires and climate change, and earthquakes are kind of coming down and down on the list. So we try to keep it alive by making sure our policymakers know that one major earthquake would be just so disruptive to not just the economy of California, but the entire United States, and you could argue for globally as well. So we are working with state governments and state policymakers. What you do is you just reach out to them. I mean, it's advocacy is something that anybody can pick up, and I really encourage it because what you're doing is you're making relationships with staffers and you're becoming a trusted advisor. Best to do it as somebody as part of an organization like ASCE or Union of Concerned Scientists or EERI, Earthquake Engineering Research Institute. But it's never a bad thing to go as yourself as a community member. So you're building relationships so that you position yourself to say these are the priorities, because often they don't know. In the one legislative cycle, they have to understand the realm of earthquakes and the different things that you can do to mitigate earthquake risk. Well, why don't we just come up as a group and say these are our priorities? The one thing that we learned in this, in federal, state, local, is that all the agencies and organizations must talk with a unified voice. If one engineer is saying, sorry, this is all you have to do to make your building safe, and another is saying something different, then they're just it actually it reduces their reliability in us. So it's really, really important not just to work in your organization, but across organizations. And we did that, and we learned that very well with the functional recovery advocacy efforts that we've been taking on since 2018. And then at the local level, I think oftentimes local governments are the least able to focus on elements of disaster risk. I mean, at most, it's fire departments doing trainings and whatnot. But I think it's really important for us to sit on these different community hearings, community meetings, show up, get yourself known by city council, and just be a voice and let people know, hey, I live in this community. These are the skills I have. If you have any questions, I hope you would reach out to me. And by the way, I think we can do X, Y, and Z things to improve our resiliency to these kinds of hazards. So I hope that kind of breaks down a bit more about kind of different levels of governance and our opportunities to make an impact. And I think any little thing is actually a big thing, because ultimately you're building relationships, and that is the root and the crux of resilience to any kind of stressor, disaster, financial, anything. It's the relationships that you make so that you can be sort of a trusted advisor. You can use your skills and position yourself in a way that goes beyond just, calcs.
Yeah, so it seems
Yeah.
like for a structural engineer, it's one way to get your expertise out there in terms of being an advisor is joining an organization that has involvement in policies, which I know you mentioned some EERI, and I know NCSEA, those organizations, they have they have policy oriented groups, right? Where that's one of their main things, is their goals is to get these documents together, present it to the policymakers, and uh, at the end of the day, it's still that relationship, right? So making connections with the policymakers and letting them know what it's about in their own language. It seems like that's one concrete way to get involved and to make a difference and use your skills as an engineer.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I keep hearing talk more and go out there and be a part of the community, involve yourself, and just let people know what we're doing and the importance of it, but try to find that positive way to deliver it. Uh, it's really interesting because I think I'm probably still struggling with this in my own life. If I can sit in a room with an engineer, a structural engineer, talk all day about structural engineering, and we'd have the best time ever. But if I go, meet somebody at, say, a restaurant or bar or grocery shopping, strike up a conversation, you want to start, even sometimes my family members, you start talking about structural engineering, you kind of feel like you're pushing information on them that they maybe don't particularly care too much about. So I think that's in its own a hurdle for structural engineers, is just getting past we do really interesting work that is very beneficial to the entire community, wherever our buildings are done. And I think we can take it a step further and benefit the community more if we tell them a little bit more about why we do it and how we do it.
Absolutely. And in doing so, you encourage more people to become structural engineers. We don't, at least in my high school, I didn't know what a structural engineer was. So can you imagine the downstream effects of just talking about what you do in a way that is relevant for people and inspires them?
That's a really funny point, because when I went to go to Cal Poly, um, I didn't particularly know I wanted to be a structural engineer. I saw the architectural engineering department. I enjoyed the architecture drafting classes I had in high school. I know I was good at math, and I said, "Oh, architectural engineering's math and art. Let's go pursue that." And I think I got lucky, but I think, I mean, there's some programs out there like I think it's Pace or Ace Mentorship. I really hope I got that right, but
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
even that's something that structural engineers could get a little bit more involved with. Obviously, CEOC's out there, but anything you can do with the younger population, be it high school or college, to get the word out, I think they're going to talk more than anybody. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, I don't have any more questions. Do you, Matt?
well, I wanted to, as a final question, do you have any final tips, Zahraa, or advice to give to engineers that want to use their technical skills to create more equitable spaces and resilient communities?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. I think I'm putting on my professor hat here and trying to think aspirationally or talk aspirationally, but I think that it's great to not silo yourself. I think you can be a really great structural engineer and focus on getting all the skills that you think, would make you a great structural engineer. But I think that there's always room to expand into something that is unfamiliar, maybe can feel a little scary, but that's open to you. And I think now knowledge is at our fingertips and it's everywhere and it's so easy to access, even, more than what I had when I was in school. So your technical skills are so powerful. They do so much good and they silently do good. Nobody knows the effort that goes in making a pedestrian bridge to make sure that you had all the safety factors in correctly and all the different kinds of whatever, the inertia and everything that you made it so perfect. But nobody knows that until until a disaster happens. So we're silently doing all this fantastic work for life safety. And I think that, we can push ourselves to see where our knowledge fits in a broader sort of social governance, political and economic sense too. And so when we work with our communities, we begin to understand that, hey, my passion is earthquake safety. However, somebody else's passion may be, I want to make sure my dog is safe after the earthquake happens or after this landslide happens. What am I going to do with my dog? What am I going to? So what I'm saying is when you put a listening ear to what are people's priorities, you're better able to fit your own passions that should be known to everybody, in terms of structural safety and seismic safety or disaster risk reduction, but you embed it in a way that makes you part and parcel of what makes a community resilient. And I think in order to do that, you kind of have to keep expanding your mind and keep knowing that, hey, I'm a great engineer, but I can also be a really great asset to my community, especially in the wake of different kinds of hazards and disasters that are ever increasing. And the last thing I kind of want to highlight is that I don't personally do not think resilience. I think that resilience without equity is not really resilience. I think that we have to be very cognizant of the fact that if we aren't considering equity and we're not considering who gets hit the most and how they will get hit when the disaster happens, we're just rebuilding the same fragility or building the same social fabric that's going to repeat itself in the same people that are going to have less than what they already had. And so we have the tools to change that narrative. It can be one building at a time. It could be one community meeting at a time. It could be one outreach to your policymaker at a time. But I don't think that I think every engineer should think about that and not limit themselves to what is in front of them, but really think about what makes me a contribution to society. And I'm very pleased to see that now at the university level, these kinds of purposeful, purpose-driven conversations are happening more and more. And so I hope that this doesn't become what I'm saying now, it just becomes fact. And more people see structural engineering as a way to improve the lives of everybody, even beyond buildings.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. And I think that resonates to the point of we're not just engineers, we're doing something, we're using our skills to impact the community. I mean, essentially, that's what we're doing as engineers, making our communities better uh, through our spreadsheets, through our calculations, and yeah, getting out of the silo instead of just doing that, getting in touch with those communities. I think that's one of the most fulfilling things where I've designed some buildings, for example, and getting them going there with I made designed a building with a building that my brother goes to a lot, and it's really cool to see that it's being used and being a part of that community. It really is something. They're not just buildings; there's people's homes and communities that they go to. So thanks for reiterating that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and this part is kind of comes out of my past, but I went out to Haiti after the earthquake out there, and I think uh, the importance of equity and resilience really stood out. I mean, it's a little bit different of a country, so even like the capital sustained quite a bit of damage in that earthquake. But I was there good 2 years after, And the lower or the less well-off people, 2 years after the earthquake, are still in FEMA tents, and their houses are pretty much just rubble on the ground. Nobody's clearing the lot. But then you could go right next door, and there'd be, the main cell phone company or a hospital, businesses that have the kind of cash to get a well-engineered structure, and there's no damage. The building's operational. But the community is just suffering because they ignored half of it, or probably even more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a little
Well,
bit of it's a bit of a paradox. I mean, we don't that you guys can keep this in or not, but it's a bit of a paradox because what happens is that when you, at least in the United States, what is most visible and what is most heroic for a politician is what people see them do after the disaster. Nobody's going to think about the counterfactual. If this politician put in a retrofit policy and everybody's homes were retrofit in this particular neighborhood that had, you know, maybe a less socioeconomically well-off community, but their homes are now retrofit. No one's going to look at them after the disaster and say, oh, what a great job, because counterfactually, that building didn't fall, so you wouldn't know if this earthquake would have impacted it. So it's politically advantageous for them to focus on recovery. But what we're saying as engineers is that no, there's so much more to gain if we focus on preventative measures, on anticipatory design, on retrofit, on addressing these things before, but that's very costly, even though we know that it's going to cost way less than the recovery efforts and the recovery situation. And so these are the kinds of balances. And ultimately what happens is that you have to have a policymaker that really believes in disaster safety, like to their core, to put their own tenure on the line a little bit and say, no, all this money is going to go into this retrofit, even though it's invisible. And so, you get into the heads of these policymakers, and it's really fascinating to see what kinds of questions and push and pull that they're faced with. And I honestly think it makes you a better engineer, because we also have to contend with very different people's priorities and perspectives: the client, the owner, the planner, the city government, the code official. It's not just what we want, what we think is the best. It's always a compromise. And I think in every way, shape, and form, you and as a person just dealing with life, those kinds of this experience really helps you understand how difficult these questions are. And so how do we take what we know and actually make it useful and collaborative rather than an impediment and being stubborn, like, no, if we do not build it to this code level, we're just not participating. We're not going to do that, right? But some people feel that way. So I just wanted to share that element of kind of my reflection on working with policymakers and how interesting and fascinating and hard it is, honestly.
yeah, that's a great point. I mean, they're people too, and we kind of have to communicate or know what some of their priorities are, what they prioritize. It's like, reminds me of the California fires. Um, it was all about, hey, you could have done this, you could have implemented this, but you didn't, even though you knew. So it's kind of just like kind of doing the policy game. But to yours and Alex's point about Haiti, it's if there's that equity isn't there in terms of resiliency, sure, all those big companies can be safe, but what communities are they going to be serving if the community isn't there? Yeah, it has to be equitable. But
Yeah,
I know we're out of time.
absolutely.
Thanks so much, Zahraa. I really appreciate it.
Thank you
This is
so
a really interesting
much.
conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me and letting me.
I hope you enjoyed the episode today. We would love to hear your feedback, comments, or questions. To leave them, please visit thestructuralengineeringchannel.com. There you will find a summary of key points discussed in today's episode, as well as links to any of the resources or websites mentioned during this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Until the next time, we wish you the best in all your structural engineering endeavors.